What you are witnessing is real. The participants are not actors. They are actual video game companies with cases pending in a federal bankruptcy court. All parties have agreed to flood the market with VCS cartridges and have their fates recorded here in our forum, the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Welcome back, everybody, for part 2 of the Video Game Crash 40th Anniversary. Today, we will pick up where we left off last time. Well, sort of. We're going to go back to where we started last time to describe not the big 900-pound gorilla of the market that did not have the rights to Donkey Kong, Atari, and instead focus today on all the other players that aided and abetted in the video game crash of 1982 and 1983. I'm your host, Carl, and once again, I am joined by our esteemed panel of experts. And again, going around in order that may or may not be clockwise to what you're seeing on the video if you're a Patreon supporter of the show, we have Dale from the Great White Northern Frozen Plains of Canada. Welcome, Mr. Geddes.
Hello.
And hello, yes. And we have our Department of Corrections expert, as always, known to those of the show. And yeah, it's way too late for me to be making any sense. Ethan! Ethan!
Hey, Carl!
How are you doing?
Hi. Good.
Hi. Yeah. I don't know how to react to that other than, oh, I could have booked somebody else. No, just kidding. Okay, and finally, from the podcast They Create Worlds, the person who will be doing most of the talking today, yay, easy night, Alex Smith.
Hello.
So, how do we want to start this everybody else episode of the 40th anniversary of the video game crash?
Well, let's first give a little.
Who should we look at?
Let's first give a little summary of kind of what we talked about last time. Give a little, in case you need to refresh after that long extravaganza.
2 hours later, and that's why Atari crashed the industry.
No, we established it was not Atari, and it wasn't ET, and it wasn't 1942. It was the color purple. Okay, yes.
It was the color purple.
Yes,
I think a 2-minute summary is in order to anyone brazen enough to have joined us for part 2.
If you take nothing else out of part 1, just remember that 1941 was done at Universal Studios, and the color purple was done with Warner Brothers. That was the most important takeaway.
I'm still waiting for Dale to tell us how Bob Dylan factors into this.
We covered that. He was the only. That was the only act worthy of the Warner label back when they wanted to own this. But I think a 2-minute summary for those who either were absent from part 1, or maybe more importantly, for anyone brazen enough to have survived part 1 who has come back for seconds.
Yes.
Okay, so Atari is the company that gets the ball rolling with a first truly popular programmable video game system, as well as, of course, being the originator of many, if not for a good while, majority of popular arcade cabinets, position that has been building over the last, and going to Christmas of 81, bombastic business. It's really only one console that's a competitor, which is the Intellivision, which is a distant, also ran. All the big arcade licenses, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, etc., are all on the VCS. They couldn't keep up with demand in 81, so everybody, ready, full of FOMO. They miss out, retailers and publishers. But the landscape by 82 had changed. Atari is not controlling virtually the entire market. Instead, by the Christmas of 82, we have a plethora of new contenders for the throne and publishers trying to make to get those sales.
But
is that a good way of summarizing it?
Well, that wasn't the pure issue. The pure issue was more the fact that they didn't have really a sense of what was going out because of weird financial controls and competition within Atari itself, and a good healthy dose of arrogance thrown in there as well. And therefore, by the time that you hit the middle of 1982, they're way out of whack on what they need to do in order to prevent something like this, and therefore they overproject, and it becomes a big bomb waiting to blow.
Yep. But, I mean, the bad accounting wouldn't have meant anything if they were still the only publisher of games on the system.
Not necessarily. Well, if you have more than 200% of what people can buy out there, then...
The missing element here is that there were the retailers, the distributors and retail purchasers had suffered this for 2 previous Christmases. 79, they ordered stock. They couldn't get it. 80, they ordered, 3 years. 80, they ordered even more stock thanks to the drive of Space Invaders. Couldn't get it. They began overestimating their own requests in order to accommodate that. At the same time, by the time you hit 81, the same thing had occurred. Now, after several years, the manufacturers have finally ramped up to the point where they will finally be able to meet the demand, but the demand is still being overcast with the assumption that those manufacturers are not going to be able to meet it. Add to that all of Atari's loose management systems in terms of their inventory control, and you don't even know that it's occurring. You certainly don't know what degree to which it's occurring. As we discovered before, there are some canaries chirping in the coal mines before the December date, but truly it's only once the orders and shipping have truly come in October, in November, then it's like, oh, now we are overstocked. We are going to have trouble moving this off the shelves. And even though the sales demands may have come close to what Atari thought would happen, not 100% of it was theirs, and the stores were already sitting on roughly, say, 200% of stock that they couldn't, that was never going to move in a single Christmas. And then it's all ET's fault at that point.
Yep, entirely to that.
But that would be the 2 minute summary of how you get to the, or more, I guess, the point.
Look at that, Dale being concise to make up for Alex. Look at that.
I write this on my calendar. Nice little red circle.
Yeah, I love it. So, and of course, we launched it on the specific date where Atari's, Warner's stock. You have to be very careful. Alex is in the room.
WCI.
Warner's stock fell very hard because of their guidance, not their actual announcement of their figures. Yeah. And with it went a lot of the value in the video game stocks as well.
Mm-hmm. And computer. Yeah, technology stocks generally. It hit some of the computer stocks as well.
So where I think we should pick up from this is the next major event that happens in the year. So Christmas goes by, and we're still sitting on the same general problem at the moment. And the next major thing that happens is January 1983 CES, which is a good kind of demonstrative place to pick up and start talking about what are people thinking of here at the beginning of the year. There's about a month and a half later after the big announcement where, the Warner stock fell. So what are people feeling like? Everybody knows about it. People are still talking about what happened in that last quarter of the year. But there's some optimism out there. And so we'll go piece by piece and look at what each of the individual players is doing. The January 1983 issue of Electronics for Kids, which was a supplemental magazine inside one of the toy mags, its headline article is "Reports of a Video Game Downturn Are Exaggerated." And, they're basically saying stocks don't mean anything for what's on the ground. As the one political podcast I listen to likes to say, the stock market is just a graph of rich people's feelings. So doesn't really matter for what what the retailers and the distributors and the people who are making the toys ultimately do. Because a lot of that stock actually rebounded. it did a pretty good rebound. The computer stocks more than the toy stocks, but like as we mentioned last time, Coleco had a good year. So even though they got hit by that thing, they came back. They did not suffer in the long term just because Atari said, "Oh, there's kind of a problem with our earnings." Because that didn't necessarily tell everybody what the problem was.
Yeah, though some of this is, I mean, there's a combination of things going on here. Some of this is, the sky may not be falling as much as people think, but part of it is also, really, guys, the sky's not falling honest. I mean, some of it is trying to create self-fulfilling prophecy as well. Yeah. But you basically have three categories of companies going into 1983 here. The first category is Atari, which we've already talked about in depth, and Mattel. And these are hardware manufacturers that were hit really hard. We've already talked about Atari's problems, so we won't go there again. Mattel had problems because they were getting squeezed out of the market. Because with Coleco being the brand new kid on the block, there was a higher end system that was better than theirs, cheaper than theirs, and had fancy licenses that they didn't have. And then on the lower end, there was Atari, which the Intellivision was always going to be more expensive than the VCS, and it was always playing off of its technological superiority to get its niche market. And now it couldn't do that anymore because of the Colecovision on the other side. So Mattel starts warning about some adjustments because they're a public company. They start warning about some $100+ million losses coming down the pipe as well because their system is getting squeezed out. And I've talked also to people at Mattel. I talked to Josh Denham, who was the president of Mattel Electronics at the time. And, he said that for 1982, they got $1 billion with a B in orders. He's going from memory. So, it may not be completely accurate, but that's a big number. And as he said to me, we knew that was too high. Because Mattel is a very disciplined company that was always at the forefront of innovating in market research on the toy side. They were one of the first companies, even before this video game thing, that actually started trying to figure out how product was moving by going out and counting inventory on the racks. Ruth Handler would hire people, a lot of them out-of-work teachers, and would send them out to stores and have them count inventory so they would have an idea of what was going on. And they were doing that before other companies in the toy business were doing it. They were getting into market research before other companies in the toy business. So this is a sophisticated and relatively disciplined organization, contrast with Atari. And as Josh Denham said, we knew that was too much. We knew there really wasn't a market for $1 billion worth of our product. But the problem was we didn't know what the actual number was either. And so they tried to thread the needle between what was ordered and what their expectations were, but they didn't fully take into account that Colecovision was going to clean their clock. And it did. If you look at the analyst reports afterwards, the Colecovision did great, and it mostly stole from Intellivision. It wasn't stealing from the 2600. And it wasn't stealing from the 5200 yet, only because both consoles were supply constrained in 1982. So Atari was selling basically all it could of the 5200 and 82, but it couldn't make that much. Once these two systems go head to head in 83, a very different picture emerges. But Intellivision is dying on the vine in 82. And so they're reporting that they're going to have huge losses as well because their stuff didn't move. So that's group one. Hardware makers, Atari, and Mattel. Group two is Coleco all by itself. Coleco had a phenomenal 1982. Not only did they sell everything they could of ColecoVision, not only did they sell a lot of ColecoVision cartridges, but Donkey Kong was in very high demand on the VCS. So they sold a lot of VCS cartridges.
But I was told they made a bad version of Donkey Kong deliberately so that people wouldn't buy it.
Shout out to VCS, you mean? That's the old VCS,
that's what,
right. Yes.
That's a conspiracy theory, which of course is not true because the creator of Donkey Kong on the VCS, it was Gary Kitchen, right? It was Gary, not Dan.
Yes.
Yeah. Gary Kitchen, he did some amazing stuff to even get that to work. So it was as good a port as you could possibly make. And they sold a lot of them, and they sold a lot of Colecovisions. So their earnings were great. Their outlook was great. They were breaking records for themselves. They're another public company, so they're reporting. Great year. Then you had the third-party publishers, and this is the third group that's a bit of a mixed group. The top-tier guys, the guys we talked about last time, they had a great year. Imagic, Parker Brothers, Activision, they all had a great Christmas overall. And they were all very bullish. They were trying to give the appearance of being bullish, but in some cases, you could also see that they had done a great job. There were some warning signs in what their fourth quarter numbers looked like, but you didn't get as detailed a breakdown of their figures because none of them were public yet, though Activision did publish a prospectus because they were in the process of going public. But these companies did great. Then you had the others, the less great companies, the also-rans, the Games by Apollos and US Gameses of the world, and even the smaller companies, they didn't do so great. And some of them were starting to fall apart and go away. But nobody thought that that was going to destroy the entire market. If you look at ads at that time, yeah, you have US Games Space Jockey basically being given away for free by the end of the year. $6 with a $3 factory rebate. So like $3. But other cartridges are still going for much closer to regular price, even in the post-Christmas period when there's some clearance going on. Clearance prices for most new releases is still in the $20 to $25 range, which is something we talked about last time.
And in general, the retailers are liking the price plunges, at least in the toy sector. They are very positive about the fact that the prices are falling because they think that this is going to be kind of the gateway to a mass market thing. And they're still getting good margins when they can sell them. But, so people, what I want to kind of emphasize is that at the beginning of the year, the problem has not been fully recognized. Even though there has been some dumping and there's been, probably a couple, places that are really starting to see that that's a lot of stock left on shelves after Christmas. They did not think that this was as big a problem as it was.
Mm-hmm. And in some of the reports that we have seen, like I remember seeing some of the newspaper clippings that do even predate the December warning, was that the thinking was this would hit the U.S. Gameses. This would hit the Games by Apollos. Yeah. The Ataris of the world would survive practically unscathed. The Activisions may also not. Yeah. It was seen as we're going to purge out the lower quality stuff. Yeah. And I mean, it was a known entity that you had. It was an established enough market, and that's what Activision made its bones on. Is that at this point there wasn't just anything we can get onto a VCS. There were good games and there were bad games. Yeah.
Because clearance in this industry was nothing new. I mean, when RCA dropped out of the market with the Studio 2 in 1978, they dumped their product at clearance. When Fairchild sold to Zircon, the Channel Fs, a lot of their stuff was dumped at clearance. There had been clearance in video games before. There was no reason to think that just because US Games Space Jockey was now on clearance, that Pitfall was going to be on clearance, that Qbert, which comes out in 1983 from Parker Brothers, is going to be on clearance. There's no reason to think that the hits won't keep being hits just because there's some softening at the bottom of the market.
So I want to kind of go through piece by piece with the major players, and then we're going to talk about who are the people who are kind of entering right at this moment. And it was very interesting. The same thing that I mentioned before, Electronics for Kids. They talked to the heads of these, well, not always the heads, but major figures in these companies, and asked them what their perspective on the market in 1983 is. So we'll go bit by bit, and we'll kind of say where they're at the moment.
Though before you start, as a caveat, these are manufacturers talking to a trade that deals with distributors and retailers within the industry. So the last thing they want to do is cause a panic. I mean, it's always going to look good going forward in this context.
And it's not, and I'm not saying this from the perspective of, that they know everything's hunky-dory and fine. I think that it's interesting in how they thought what direction they could go from here, whether or not the market was good. Just what were they looking at as the potential out for them? So starting with Atari, we have president of the U.S. Consumer Division, Mike Moon. He says that he actually was giving props to original titles, which Atari was starting to do a bit more increasingly at this time. It was still not the majority of what they were putting out. They were still doing the arcade titles, and then they had the licenses like Raiders and E.T. But he was saying that original titles was really what they were going to be aiming at for the future. Because I think he saw something like Pitfall, and then he realized that, maybe that's the direction we should be looking rather than these arcade conversions. Then we have Mattel, Peter Perner. I think he's a marketing guy. He thinks that the major problem is price pressure. The pressure to come down is the big thing that's kind of, driving the market at the moment. And I think that's kind of in part because there's, a little bit of dumping some of the, the space jockeys and all that, trying to drive even the good people who are making cartridges further down on the price chain. Then Jim Levy, president of Activision, president, right? Not CEO.
I think president and CEO.
Okay, I think president and CEO. He thinks that at the time Activision was saying, "Oh, we're going to start moving into the home computer market." We'll get way more into this in a bit. But he says that what they're doing is strategic. It's not something they need to do. That this is just another avenue that their games can go into, and we'll see how well that works out for them.
Well, and just as an aside to that, before you go on to the next one, we do have to remember that Activision was in the process of trying to go public at this time, and they do go public in March of 1983. And as is obvious from articles at the time and from my interview with Jim Levy as well, one of the reasons that they were able to go public in this time when there was some uncertainty around cartridges in general is that he was really trying to present the company as an electronic entertainment company. And these were artists creating original titles in an exciting new area of electronic entertainment. And he was trying to divorce the concept of Activision from just being a VCS company, just being a video game company. And this strategy was very successful, combined with the fact that they did have a good Christmas in 82. This strategy allowed them to go public right before things went terribly wrong for them as well.
Then we have their main competitor, Imagic. Bill Grubb, president of Imagic, says that advertising is the central strategy. And you've probably seen this, Carl. Imagic was very big on their advertising campaigns. Activision also had good advertising, but the Imagic had this very distinctive style to their advertising, and they were going at a very specific market, the hardcore players. That was their kind of way of overcoming, any sense of like the quality fading or anything. That they are the people who are catering to the hardcore. They were the FromSoft of their day.
Yeah, and the New York Times kept reporting it was them and Games by Apollo basically kept trying to outdo each other in ad spending. And the millions that they're throwing around for these games is quite disturbing.
And how well that work out for Games by Apollo?
But that was one of the problems that was identified, is that with so many companies on the market, how you promoted and marketed. Promoted being things like sweepstakes and giveaways, and marketing being your advertising. How you promoted and marketed was seen as something that was going to be a main determiner of how well you were going to do by Bill Grubb, but not just by Bill Grubb, by a lot of people. And that was seen as one of the things that was going to cause a lot of the smaller companies to have to get out, is they just would not be able to bring the marketing support to stand out in this crowded field.
Now we have.
This just wanted to say, because most of these games are being sold through toy retailers, and one of the things that keeps showing up in the toy retailer publications is they really divide the toys into two sections. toys advertised on TV and toys not advertised on TV. And it's this very clear line that they have certain expectations for sales, and if it's going to be advertised on TV, order a bunch of them to coordinate with the ad spend. And so I think
in general, this was a big thing that was changing in the late 70s.
Yeah, but I do want to correct you on one point a little bit. While toy stores were part of this tapestry, they are actually not one of the primary places as a category where these video games are. And there's actually another divide that is a lot bigger, which is the divide between the chain stores and the non-chain stores across all fields. Like in the toy industry, Toys R Us and Child's World were very, very in on the video game industry and very, very committed to it. And a lot of the mom and pop stores, which still made up a large part of the toy industry at this time, they were a lot more skittish around it still because it was hard for them to remain competitive on price because they didn't have the volume. And you actually see in this period a lot of more mom and pop stores, a lot of smaller stores in the toy business actually really reconsidering whether they want to be in it, because the other place where a lot of this is happening is it's happening in video and camera stores, electronic stores, and then your mass market merchandisers and department stores. That's where a lot of your business actually is. And a lot of that video camera electronic store business is also more of a mom and pop kind of business. And you see them complaining about the Searses and Targets and Kmarts of the world because they can't compete with them. And so that's really a lot of where the divide is. Toy stores are part of this tapestry, but they're not actually the majority place where video game business is being done.
Okay, do we have any idea what the breakdown of percentages are on that? Because that would be interesting to actually get this idea. I mean, we all, if we're old enough to remember it, I mean, we just recently had this discussion over Twitter. 7-Eleven is advertising themselves as the Atari outlet. The pervasiveness of the product, especially because this is also a time period when VHS tapes are available for purchase, but they're still in the $60 to $70 category. It's actually in November. This will be on something mentioned in the next episode of Video Game Newsroom Time Machine Plug. November 82. They just announced that the first videotape that's going to retail for only $30 is going to be Wrath of Khan, and they're bringing it out as an experiment to see, well, can we increase the sales numbers above? Is this an acceptable price? But that would play along with what you just said, Alex. If you're looking at video or television stores, electronic stores, the idea of selling media, with the exception of records, hasn't been a part of their business yet.
Software, as they all called it back in the day.
Exactly. But software is something that a Sears can easily put on the shelf. It doesn't require sort of the hand-holding and explanations that a mom and pop might be able to sell as a additional service to a customer who is willing to pay a little bit more, but to get the explanation of how the hell do I use this thing. So, yeah, I can definitely see how that would be a factor. But, yeah, again, sorry. The numbers would be interesting, at least to get a general idea what percentage was toy store, what percentage wasn't. And, of course, chain versus mom and pop. But if we don't have that, we don't have it.
I don't have chain versus mom and pop, but there are some kind of breakdowns in some of the market studies that I have that have some of the breakdowns of different types of retailers. And I'm just in real time here trying to figure out how to interpret this data that I have.
I'll filibuster for a minute.
Go right ahead.
I'm absolutely baffled that there wasn't like a run on shoplifting in the 7-Elevens. Because really, if Qbert was just sitting there on the counter next to the Slurpee, How do you stop the teenagers from grabbing Hubert and running out the door?
I mean, I imagine that's one of the reasons that this didn't go on for too long. I mean, it's like I remember I've looked through some of these, some of the later magazines when you get it. It's only once you get into the 90s that they control like the electronic stuff because they realize the margins are just so huge that they need to protect that stuff. It takes a long time for that to like really be realized that that's the deal.
Well,
the thing.
I don't know how 7-Eleven did it, but I still remember in Toys R Us, the software was never available to you. It was one of those things where they'd have a rack where you'd be able to look at like a little foldout.
That's a different situation where they could make like a section for, proto world of Nintendo. And in fact, actually, there was a World of Atari concept that they were trying to put together in this time that I thought was interesting. But that's different. I'm just talking about, a store that is not specialized in this kind of thing, putting that stuff together. And having a lock on it is different from just having it out of reach.
Yeah, but I mean, 7-Eleven would have had experience with this. They were already selling product that had to be behind counters for age restrictions like cigarettes and pornography.
Well, yeah,
I can't imagine that they would have just put the cartridges out on the shelf.
Yeah, well, we don't necessarily know.
But I do know that in all of the retail outlets, the chain stores for sure, it was expected even as early as 81 for sales purposes to have a demos display as well.
Yes,
it was almost unthinkable to walk into a Sears or a Kmart. Fine, and believe me, that's the first place I went to when I went to the Sears. The Kmart was, I'll meet you in clothes later. I'm into the video games. Off to the video games. There was the demonstration unit. You were disappointed if the demonstration unit wasn't working or had some dumb, it's just combat. Oh, well, okay. Well,
yeah.
Or you walked in and it was a CDI in the 90s and you were like, seriously?
I was out of the game at that point. But nonetheless, you wouldn't have expected to have seen that in your 7-Eleven mom and pops. There was more overhead for that, for them to sell that, let alone what one was getting into, because these are also not cheap products at this point. These are still, like, how much would a retailer pay for these products?
A retailer would pay around $20, I think, for a $35 cartridge.
Yeah, but that's
less than that.
Over 50%? Over 50%?
Well, it's always, people always say the double, but that's just oversimplifying things. They make a little less than double.
Okay.
From everything that I've seen, it's all because like the distributor, the materials cost about like $2 to $6. They sell that to the retailer for like $16, I think. Yeah, I remember we kind of went through some of this earlier. And then
you're buying these at lots of $250. Like these are coming in boxes of 200. Well, maybe not 250. I'm pulling that number just out of the air, but
yeah. But we're getting a little off track. Alex, have you data yet?
I believe so. If I'm reading the data correctly here, and this does stand to reason based on other things I've seen, that department stores were still the largest overall generator of sales. And a lot of this is because this was a time when you didn't have an adult population that was very educated on video games. And of course, the adults are doing the purchasing, mom and grandma. And the department store was the place where you could most easily and more readily have demonstration units set out and have dedicated staff that can walk you through what's available and kind of educate you on these things. They were still accounting for perhaps as much as just under 50% of sales in video games.
Wow.
And then next was the discount mass merchandisers, which again, this is the tension that was starting to develop because part of what was driving prices down, and not driving prices down to the later crazy $10, $5, $2 levels, but driving prices down from like the $35 level to the $25 level, was the fact that these mass merchant discounters were getting in to the market, the Kmarts of the world.
Yeah, Kmart would undercut it by $4.
Yeah, and we're able to undercut.
And believe me, my family would run for the $4 savings to Kmart because they were advertised.
Yeah, and they were about another third of the business. And then After that, it was kind of catalog sales, was about 10%. And then your audio, video, electronics stores, places that were dedicated to various types of electronic equipment. Toy specialty stores, according to this, if I'm reading the data right, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's the sales volume. They actually accounted for a very small amount of the sales. And again, it's because outside of the Toys R Us's and Child Worlds, a lot of the smaller mom and pop businesses weren't getting into this business in a very real way. However, when you talk about electronic games as a percentage of total sales, like for toy stores, it jumps way up. Like toy stores were becoming more and more dependent on video games as a driver of their profits because the video game had such high margins compared to a normal toy. And so toy stores were very invested in this, but they weren't actually one of the main places people were going to make these purchases, if I'm reading the data right. And I could be reading the data slightly wrong, but it tracks from what I know, even if the percentages aren't quite what they are here. It tracks with what I know, that department stores and mass merchants were really where it was at in this time period.
All right. So to bring it back, we're still not done with the major players here. So let's bring back, and we'll talk Coleco. Mike Katz, who is VP of marketing.
Or of market communications. His title kind of is a little vague. Sometimes he's referred to as VP of marketing, sometimes marketing communications.
Oh, wait, 1 second. Before we move on to that, just a follow up to those numbers, Alex. Is that
he wants those numbers?
No, because the numbers in the numbers you can find stuff. Now, is that distribution, to your knowledge, pretty much generalized for all of the companies, or is there a tendency for the smaller mom and pop style stores to buy more stuff from the independent companies or the smaller companies, and the big department stores are not going to touch the I don't know.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's an excellent point. I've been doing a little poking around. I haven't done like a comprehensive study of all advertising in 1982 or something like that, but I've been poking around. And what you absolutely find is that companies like US Games and Games by Apollo, these smaller independent guys that aren't one of the big 5 or 6.
Well, US Games is no longer independent by late 82.
Yeah, but their Quaker Oats has bought them by that point. But still, they are still essentially the same vid tech. And Quaker Oats hasn't put a lot behind them yet by the end of 1982. Some of the ads in late 1982 even still have VidTech box covers on them instead of US Games box covers. So these smaller guys, you tend to see them more in the mom and pop kind of electronic stores and camera stores, video stores, and whatnot than you do in the department stores. And it's not just like the individual ads. They'll sometimes be the companies themselves will take out blanket ads in a region saying, these are our new games and you can find them at these fine dealers. And then you look at the list and it's almost all mom and pops, independents, and a lot of camera stores and electronic stores. The interesting thing, I can't remember if it was US Games or Games by Apollo now, but it was one of the two. I saw an ad from town I've lived in for many years, St. Louis, that was listing all of their places. And none of the even local St. Louis department stores and mass market, I keep having problems with that, mass merchant retailers that were active in that area at the time, like Famous Bar and Venture, companies that I know because, I was there. None of those companies are showing up, but what does show up is Schnucks and Dierberg's, which were the two local grocery store chains.
Wow.
and solely groceries. It's not like they were groceries that also had like some special boutique section. These are grocery stores. That's what so they weren't able to get into, like the national chains like Sears and Penney's. They weren't even able to get into the local department store Famous Bar or the local mass merchant discounter Venture. They were getting into the grocery stores in the market. And so there is some divide there. We kind of talked about this last time. the big guys weren't doing much with these companies. Now, they'd buy a little. I mean, you occasionally, like when Space Jockey was on clearance, I saw a Sears store that was also advertising their Space Jockey on clearance. So they weren't completely shut out of these places, but I think that they did push into these independent places. And I know, like Magnavox, for instance, Magnavox was definitely more present with its Odyssey 2 system in kind of local electronic stores and whatnot than it was in big department stores, because they didn't even expand outside of their dealer network until 1982, which is just crazy. And so that is one thing we have to keep in mind as well, is you didn't necessarily think that there was going to be as much as a crisis, because the Kmarts of the world and the Searses of the world and the Pennies of the world were pushing the brands that were being successful. The brands that were not having success, they were either being not pushed at all by these bigger companies, or they were being pushed in much lower numbers. So it's not like their business was going to suddenly fall apart because Games by Apollo has gone bankrupt.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now we can go back.
That up.
We can
go back again.
Finally resume. All right. Mike Katz, Coleco. Basically, he saw the market as that all arcade games are going to sell no matter what, which kind of belies the downturn in the arcade, which is something we won't talk about. We kind of
but what company is buying up all the new arcade licenses right now?
I'm well aware that this is an extremely biased take, and he will also be out of Coleco by the end of the year. So what he really says is kind of far more immaterial of what Coleco was actually going for. We'll see what Coleco is actually going for a bit later. Then we have Magnavox, Gerald Michelson. He says that there needs to be new technology in the field, like Laserdisc, because actually they were promoting a Laserdisc player for the Odyssey 2 way before even Astron Belt.
Well, and this is because the Magnavox brand is owned by North American Philips, which is connected to Philips, which was one of the pioneers of disc technology, and Magnavox has actually gone all in on Laserdisc. They are trying to turn that into a home format. So of course, the head of the game side of things is going to say, we need new technology, because they have like the worst system on the market, essentially. There's some things that may be a little better than the 2600, but anyway.
Emerson Arcadia, man.
Yeah. Oh God.
There's that.
But also Magnavox and North American Philips as a company is pushing Laserdisc. So of course the Magnavox guy is going to say Laserdisc.
But other people will also say Laserdisc, like Coleco says. They catch on to the Laserdisc thing, and that's a whole thing. You can read about it in my book. Anyways, lastly,
because they had to buy the latest arcade titles, so they bought Dragon's Lair, and it's like, oh dear, I guess we need Laserdisc in the home now.
And lastly, we have Parker Brothers, John Call and Rich Stearns, and they basically they echo Darwin. Only the strong will survive, which as we mentioned was kind of the feeling in the press at the time. So that's the major people who were already in the market. And now at January 1983 CES, there is a huge influx of new players, and those players are the media companies coming in. So it's because of this mass interest in the Atari market, and because Atari was owned by Warner Communications, every movie studio started having the question, what are we doing about video games? How are we going to take part in this market? And some of them kept kind of arm's length. Universal doesn't touch it, for instance. They license like the stuff to Tiger and whatnot, but they are not involved in that way. MCA Universal, I should say. But other media companies are coming in. So there's CBS, who already had a deal with Coleco. They were going to help distribute the Colecovision outside of North America. So their CBS software group, they decide that they are going to license games from Bally, because Bally already had their disaster, and they're not coming back into the console market. We'll talk about the Bally Professional Arcade one of these days. When you come around in 2028, Carl, we'll come back around to the Bally Professional Arcade. So they're fronting for Bally, because Bally is one of the companies that's just not going to be involved from the arcade side in the home market directly. Then you have 20th Century Fox, who decides to partner with one of the big action-based computer game companies, which is Sirius Software. And we'll see kind of the outgrowth of the computer game stuff getting involved. They get a guy from who worked at Mattel to head their division.
They actually buy his company. So
Yeah,
Frank
right.
O'Connell started a video game startup after he left Mattel, and
they have
Fox
their own
acquired the startup.
Yeah, they have their own independent development thing, and then Sirius Software is also helping them out. So they're kind of fronting a company that already makes games to try and get them some clout. That's the way they're going to get clout, because they're not they
That
do
and MASH.
Yeah, MASH. Yeah, I was about to bring. Yeah, I just remembered. Yeah, they did a MASH game. Yeah,
also everybody remember I've already interviewed Jerry Jewell, co-founder of Sirius Software, and he went into great depth as to how basically he got screwed over by 20th Century Fox when they just refused to pay. And he actually had to carry the cost of manufacturing those cartridges that bear the name, so the other company's logo on them. So yeah.
So that's how that winds up. And we also have U.S. Games, as we mentioned before, subsidiary of Quaker Oats. Oh my God, Alex, an oatmeal company.
You forgot your favorite media company, though. You forgot your favorite media company.
Which one's that?
Paramount.
Well, I'm getting there. I'm not done yet.
They also decide to enter the home for the first time.
Yes, they were kind of touching at the edges. They were helping Coleco distribute some software through their Paramount Home Video thing, and this is also related to their Sega is one of their subsidiaries, Sega Enterprises Inc. So with the backing of Gulf and Western, they decide they are going to announce dozens of licensed cartridges. And I love the list they put out. They put out this flyer where they have all the boxes of all the games they're going to do. And here are some of my favorites out of the lot. Dragon Slayer. It's kind of a weird movie, but I guess it could kind of work as a video game. 48 Hours. You get something with that, and then they got lots of Star Trek games, not too weird. Then Mission Impossible, which I think would just been difficult to do on an Atari system, and then Airplane.
Oh, nice!
Surely you can't be serious.
Is there supposed to be a mini game in there where you have to blow up the autopilot? I mean, what's
what the hell were they going to do with the Airplane game?
I can think of many scenes that would convert nicely to video game action.
To a 2600 game?
Well, it may have to be a series of 2600 games.
Well, you could invent some new sections, like you could do a lost luggage clone at the start.
Also, Marathon Man, War of the Worlds, which actually they didn't have anything new out for that. They just were like, okay, we'll just use this old property. And also Friday the 13th. Which, there was that Texas Chainsaw Massacre game. But
they did that Friday the 13th game like 2 years later on home computers, so why not?
And the NES.
Yes, there was a Friday the 13th game on the NES.
Yeah, but that is a weird, that just kind of shows that they were trying to go for a very broad kind of audience. On this thing. And basically, people see the licensing strategy as the ticket to the mainstream. This is how we get more people involved in games rather than just the kids who like their shooters.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even Atari, even the people already there were thinking in those veins. We talked last time about at the end of 82 and into 83, they were signing deals for Peanuts, for Children's Television Workshop, Sesame Street. They had a Gremlins thing in the works. They had Garfield in the works. Dukes of Hazzard. I mean, they were expanding into the media properties thing too, because that, for the exact reasons Ethan said. But it's you always know you're in for a downturn in the video game industry when the media companies get heavily involved, because they are not because the media companies themselves ruin it, but because they're always late to the party and they always misread the market. So when the media companies say now is our time, that means you're having trouble.
The one good game from that era was the Smurfs.
But Coleco did that.
But it was
that was
Coleco
just,
game.
That was just a licensed Coleco game.
You're talking about the ones that were planned for the VCS, right? Nonetheless.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be, some of these things.
VCS
first gets ported to the VCS too. There's a VCS version of Coleco.
Yeah, you're right. And it's pretty atrocious.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the media companies were getting in at this point.
And I want to kind of jump off that point of like the market everyone is still looking at is the VCS. The 5200 is launched, and they sold what they could make at that time, which was less than Coleco could make. I'm pretty sure it was Coleco sold the 550,000, and I can't remember what the reports on the 5200 were, or if there even were reports. But they were having trouble.
I think I have some sales figures hidden someplace. I don't have any to share today, but it was a sellout in 82, but as Ethan was about to say, at pretty low levels because they were having trouble producing them.
Which, for Atari, they definitely shouldn't, especially because it's technology they already put out. They have the Atari 8-bit technology rejiggered in this stupid way to make it into a new console, so everyone has to reprogram all their stuff. And the 5200 is a whole rant of its own. It was not well made, and because the VCS was in so many homes already, was it like 20 million or something like that?
I think they were somewhere between 10 and 15 at this point.
Okay, 10 and 15 million homes. That's where people thought they could sell the software into. So obviously there's that. But people were recognizing the VCS was made in 77. I think I'm not sure we can do the things we want to do on it. So some people were trying to get at this idea of like, okay, what can we do with it? Atari starts to push pretty hard on educational market, which is kind of part of the computer thing as well, because people were like seeing computers as the future of education. And so they were putting out, like these Sesame Street games and other things. So they were kind of going back to their old strategy back when they first launched the console, where they were putting out games to try and interest the parents on that level.
Well, I also think it was a recognition on the part of Atari that the VCS technology was getting old and getting cheap. And there was a feeling that this may be the system that people start to buy for their really young kids because they don't want to buy them a super expensive video game system that they'll barely know how to play anyway. You might as well buy your young kids something cheaper. So I think that's part of it too.
There were companies that were trying to come out with full computer keyboards for the VCS. It didn't upgrade the hardware. It wasn't
including
like
Atari.
One of those things. Yes, Atari was going to go back again to their computer keyboard thing.
Before we get too deep back into Atari, we're talking about the CES in early 83 now. Yes. We've seen how the stock market collapse in December of 82 basically throws everything into a tailspin. We've seen media companies are now showing their games at the CES in 83. Now, let's look at some of the players from 82. What does their presence at CES 83 look like? Where are the games by Apollo? Where are the Imagics? Where are the Activisions and so forth? What are they doing at that CES?
I mean, we were kind of going through that. There's nothing fundamentally different about what they're doing there in terms of what games they're putting out. That's not different. It's just, I thought it was more interesting to look at like what they were kind of projecting. And, as we keep bringing up games by Apollo, they're already in bankruptcy. They were
at CES.
They were. Oh yeah, they did. Yeah, they showed.
They promised everybody. They promised everyone they would be back to normal operations soon. It was all lies, but they were there.
And then you have there are other third parties out there that going to get to like Spectravision, Data Age, MTI, Telesys, Ultravision, Comavid. I love Zonix. The reason I love Zonix is because they last to 85. They keep putting out VCS cartridges in 85. They're one of those guys.
Like a boss.
Tiger Vision and also Starpath, which I was going to mention. Starpath, they had this idea of putting out the supercharger to upgrade the VCS and even potentially get other people onto their add-on package for the VCS, because you could produce them on cassettes, which were much lower price. But that's all I'll really say about that. The CES nothing is particularly astounding about it in terms of the regular players there, except they are announcing some new consoles. The Odyssey 3 being the primary one that kind of gets a hint at. Coleco is hinting at their next generation thing, which we'll talk about for the next CES. And also the Ultravision console that, whatever the heck that was going to be.
I don't think they knew what it was going to be.
But there is the big thing at January 1983 CES is home computers.
Right. So so this home computer thing really does get all wrapped up in it. I think sometimes retrospective histories tend to overstate the impact of home computers on the market crash, but there's no doubt that home computers influenced how the market was kind of trying to recover from the pressures that were being seen in the video game market crash. Like, it's competition from home computers is not what caused Atari and Mattel to have their bad quarter at the end of 1982. It's not what caused the retail glut. It's not what caused all of this disaster that would lead to the discounting and the death. But it was seen as the next step forward. It was seen as the way out. And there was seen to be a merging that was going to happen between the console market and the low-cost home computer market. And in fact, a lot of these new companies that were coming in with games on the VCS said that they were coming into the market on the VCS and on the VIC-20. And now they often didn't end up releasing on these other platforms because they never got going. But most companies were actually advertising how they were going to move on to the low-cost home computers as well. And Activision was starting to push that.
And Imagic and Parker Brothers were all saying, we're going to start making stuff for home computers, because there was this kind of merging that they have cartridges. So it became the cartridge market in home computer terms, which could either mean you were on console and computer, or just computers that like the VIC-20 and the TI-99 and that's the Atari.
And that's an important thing to remember when you look at the other side at companies like Sirius Software and like Sierra and like Broderbund, because some of the players, and we won't go in depth on this, but some of the players on the computer side were starting to raise capital and trying to get into this cartridge market. And it's not because they really wanted to be on an Atari VCS. It's because they saw that, oh, shoot, maybe the future is this broader cartridge market, which is we have these low-cost home computers that are plug and play, where, yes, you can mess around with cursors and command lines if you absolutely want to, or you can put a cartridge in the cartridge slot and bypass all of that. And so some of the bigger companies in the computer game space also thought that they were going to need to get in on this action.
Here's a quote from an article at the time that kind of encapsulates the idea in the press, which was not really the reality down on the ground, but it says, quote, parents and grandparents would rather buy a computer, which they see as an encyclopedia, than a video game player, which they see as a waste of time. To Alex's point, as before, that in 1982, there were only 2.8 million computers sold. And there were like 8 million VCSs sold. And even this coming year, it does not bypass it. But this kind of growing sentiment becomes something that all the video game companies have to contend with. They have to contend with this idea that the video game system might be supplanted by the computer, but not everyone's buying into it at first. By the time we get around to the next CES, everybody's buying into that video game systems will be done and computers are the future. But that takes a little bit of time to get around to.
Assimilated by, don't forget, because all computers at this point have, almost without exception, have a cartridge slot. And the most facile way to sell software for that, whether it's the VIC-20, the Atari 800, buy the cartridge. The cartridge fulfills the functionality of the console, and it will do that and more.
And also with the extremely limited memory, especially in the VIC-20, putting software on anything but a cartridge basically limited what you could do in that program.
You could get the RAM expander.
It was almost, yeah. Yeah, but then now you're in the problem that every Genesis owner knows. The software for add-ons is usually limited.
That's where are you going to put that RAM expansion? You know where that RAM expansion goes?
In the cartridge slot.
Right in the cartridge slot.
Yeah, but then you can need a lot of updates. Anyways, so that's CES January 1983. Now here's some impressions of what's happening in January 1983 on the retail end. This was a very cool article that I found in the LA Times in January 10th, 1983. Here some quotes to throw at you. So Bill Grubb, as we mentioned, head of Imagic, says some people call it a dump. That was already his impression of the thing. Another one, I don't know what dollar magnitude of the leftover cartridges is, but it has to be incredible. Then a thing quoting Arnold Greenberg. By Greenberg's estimate, the young video game industry has sold just 14 million to 50 million consoles to 83 million households. So how can we talk about oversaturation?
I do find that quote very funny.
Greenberg said that?
Yes.
Greenberg said that.
Because it's like, that sounds like market saturation to me. But you have to remember...
Not for Marty. Marty's going one out of every two homes is going to have a Colecovision.
You do have to remember that Coleco had a very different perspective from other companies because the market was not saturated for their product. And the price pressure was not happening on their product, not at this time. The crisis that was developing was seen as an Atari Mattel crisis, specifically. And I mean, it's called out that way in the press. Coleco is seen as in its own separate area because their system is doing great. They release all they can in 1982, and in the first half of 1983, they produce more systems in the first half of 1983 than they were able to produce for holiday 1982. And according to some analyst estimates, they were the top-selling console in the first half of 1983. Obviously, we're not to the holidays yet, which is the most important period in terms of your sales. But Coleco is really doing great. They're in their own zone here.
Do we have any idea of whether or not or is there any attempt by Coleco to market the ColecoVision as an upgrade or replacement for existing VCS owners?
Well, there is the expansion that they did.
Plays VCS games.
Yeah. So that was a big part of their marketing, especially to kind of broader the broader public. They were going on the hardcore, they were like, we have the better versions of the games. And then for the broader public, they were like, we have a thing that can play VCS games. They were very savvy in what they were doing. But yeah, they're gonna take their eye off the ball as we all know.
And the Gemini really is a problem for Atari because the real pressure that you're going to start to see in 1983 is basically that Mattel and Atari have to start massively discounting their hardware. Mattel because they've been completely squeezed out of the market. Atari, both because the technology is old, but also because they're facing pressure from clones like the Gemini that they have to keep up with as well. So what starts to happen is the hardware starts getting cut in price through both official price cuts and rebates. By April of 1983, most places you can get an Atari VCS for under $100, kind of between $85 and $95. After another round of rebating a few months later, it's down to $50, $60. Mattel is going through a similar process. By the middle of the year, there's one discounter where you can buy a Mattel and Intellivision for under $10 because it's at $59.95 and Mattel has a standing $50 rebate. So you're basically
giving it away.
buying and Intellivision, and that was a discounter selling it. By this time, Mattel's starting to liquidate because they can see that they're in real trouble. So, but the hardware pressure is actually what drives the software pressure. And I talked about this briefly in the last episode. There's kind of this phony narrative that's grown up, which is that there were too many companies, there was too much software, it didn't sell, the retailers tried to return it, these fly-by-night small companies couldn't take the returns, and so because they couldn't get money back from the software companies, they just dumped it all into $5 bins. So there's a few things wrong with that. First of all, nobody had a right of return. So it's not like they tried to return them and said no and got surprised by that. Nobody had a right of return.
Now, what I did just recently read in one of the toy publications was that some of the retailers, especially the big ones, had worked out deals for replacement.
Yes. Now you can,
we talked about
you can do stock rebalancing
on unsold inventory.
Yes, you can do stock rebalancing where you return stuff and get new stuff, or a discount on new stuff, but it's not an actual just, we want our money back. Here's your game bag. It doesn't work that way. So that part of it's false. The other part of it is that's not true, because you did have a wave of games going to clearance prices from the fly-by-night companies, but that didn't take down the rest of the market. What started to take down the rest of the market, in addition to the continuing inventory glut, because the inventory was still out there, is that once you have hardware that is $50, you can't justify selling a game for $25. The value proposition doesn't make sense to the public. How is a game only half as expensive as the thing you're playing it on? How is it that two games have equal value to one console? That value proposition doesn't work. So the hardware prices going down is one of the factors that starts driving the software prices down, even on newer titles, because that's just untenable. Plus, there's a lot of rebating that's done because since the hardware is so sluggish, there's a lot of, buy hardware and get a game free, or get a game like half price, or, a lot of that kind of like bundling kind of salesmanship as well. And so the cartridge value proposition is starting to be devalued by the hardware crisis as much as by the software crisis. There was also an inventory crisis, and it plays a role too. But we have to remember the role that hardware collapse played.
Well, it comes down to, if you're thinking about what did our games sell for last year? Well, they were somewhere between $29.99 and $34.95. Well, what will our target price be for the upcoming season? The pressure there is, as you say, it's ludicrous to have two of those cartridges of a greater value than the console itself, and they're already unable to even meet with inflationary pressures. They're already obliged to take at least 10, 15, 20% off of retail suggested price in order to keep up the sort of value proposition. So,
Young Dale was happy, though.
Sure.
And this is the crisis that was not apparent in January 1983. Even though companies like Activision and Imagic have a vested interest in putting a good face on things at that time, I don't think they probably had any inkling that there was going to be a software collapse of top tier titles. And part of that was glut in the channel, and part of that was falling hardware prices making high software prices untenable.
Just out of curiosity, and this is getting slightly off topic, but we do see a successful version of that price ratio, let's say around 1990 with the NES, where you can pick up an NES for $99, but a game cartridge like TMNT2 will put you back $60-$70. So, but that was successful. Do you have? How would you explain what changed in the perception of price relation between software and hardware at that later point? Was it just basically the supply constraints on software that Nintendo had imposed, or just a different perception by people generally about the value of software?
I mean, that's an excellent question. I can't say that I have an answer that is well researched or well considered to your question, but I think a little bit of both of what you said makes logical sense. I think that the value proposition of video games and the future of video games was a little better understood in 1990 than it was in 1982, when there was this sense that, computers were going to be taking over everything, and there wasn't a very well put together successor on the video game front, making the pitch for why these things are going to keep being relevant. I think the climate was a little different. Everyone was a little less educated in what all of this looks like. I think that's probably part of it.
The children had to come to the rescue. I mean, in 1983, you were perfectly susceptible to have your aunt go to the store. She'd consider herself a great hero, come back with a $10 game, and you'd have Haunted House. And you'd be like, no, I want Q*bert. And she'd be like, the one that's $39? Forget it. Because there was definitely a growth in the consumer consciousness of this kind of thing, I think.
So so it still takes some time for things to catch up on themselves as it comes to the software price collapse. But when it comes, oh boy, does it come! So right. It's about May 1983 when there starts to be big reports that the price of software is just completely...
Thank God, because I thought we were going to spend an hour on each month, in which case it was going to get problematic. I was all set to... If you were about to say, now in February, it was going to be like, look, we're going to run out of time. We're in May. Sorry.
Yeah, we're in May. So right. Over 50% clearances on software, and relatively recent software, stuff that was released at the beginning of 1983, is getting /50%. Because otherwise people just aren't going to touch it. One analyst, the infamous Lee Isker, says unit sales may be up 10 to 20%, but I think cartridge prices will be down 30 to 40% by the end of the year. I think he's about right. Actually, I think the unit sales were less than that. They went up, but I think it was a little bit less.
It went up from like 62 million to 75 million, whatever that percentage increase is.
So that is about 10 to 20%. So good job, Lee. He was right on the
nailed it, Lee.
Of things.
Buddy.
And there's one quote, infamous quote right here. A guy named David Pardo. I think that cartridges are going to sell for $1.99 one of these days. Love it. Now, one thing I want to quickly touch on, you actually asked this last time, Carl, is what was the situation for the European side? Did they think they could dump their stuff over there? There definitely was a sense that they might be growing in the European sector, and some companies were betting on that for their sustainability, like Imagic was putting in for that, but it was ultimately just not feasible to try and, ship all those cartridges over there. There was the conversion problem. It depended on which system you were using and whatnot. But, it was, that was something they thought might be able to save them, but it was never going to be the, make up for everything that they were losing.
Well, and also the European market had been flooded. I mean, depending on the country, by the really cheap personal computers. The UK had really adopted through that government program and the propaganda, if you will, that the future for England is, now that the coal mines are gone and the steel mills are closed, is everybody's got to learn how to program. So there would have been this class affront to, just a game console. And in Germany, Aldi, the
Aldi
food discounter, was going they're famous even today for the Aldi computer. So there's always one computer you can buy in the store, which is basically always a reduced cost, relatively high-end computer. Their first one was the VIC-20. That's what started that whole chain, which goes through till today. And, of course, they changed the name because VIC, pronounced in German, would be the V is pronounced as an F.
Yep.
You figure out what that's going to sound like. The German F-bomb is FICK, so they changed it to the VC, and they called it the Volkscomputer, the people's computer, like Volkswagen. It's a whole thing. It's quite entertaining. But so yeah.
What about my Das Vic T-shirt?
That's big. Yeah.
And one more note before we move into the next major section is that one person was saying that the top 20 titles of video games were accounting for 45% of the business. Top 20 of the software titles. So then if you recognize that the revenue is not moving, even though cartridge sales are going up and all this stuff, then you realize that the people at the bottom are really not making anything.
Exactly. And you see two different price pressures developing here. First of all, the channel is still backed up. And so at some point that stock that isn't moving has just got to be discounted down to move it out of the channel.
And further.
Yeah, further and further and further. But the other side of it is, even with new games that do not completely lose their value, that top 20 doesn't necessarily lose its value. Now, you're not selling them for $35, but you're probably still selling them for somewhere between $20 and $30. Even with that stuff, a lot of that stuff is being traded in stock balancing. A lot of it is subject to price protection because as the next guy that comes along and gets a better deal from you because you're desperate to move product is able to get it from you at a lower price and therefore charge a lower price than the people who already bought it from you are crying out that, we bought it for a higher price and we can't afford to sell it that low. You have to backstop us with price protection. So with all the stock rebalancing, with all the write-offs, and with all the price protection, even games that retailers are still able to sell in that $20 to $30 range, the manufacturer might have taken somewhat of a hit on that because of all of these financial shenanigans going on in the background to keep everyone happy, which is making it more and more untenable for the Activisions and Imagics and even Ataris of the world to keep putting out product. That's why they keep losing money, because they keep having to pay for the mistakes of the past.
And now it's May. We're on the cusp of our next big show to promote what will be the final chance to order for the upcoming Christmas of '83.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still a mess. There's still backlog stock that's not selling.
Everybody has realized at this point.
Particularly the retailers at this point are soaking in it. And so
they have no illusions any longer that this is a problem that can just be kind of worked through, that this is something that the companies are gonna help them try to get through at the moment.
So here I come as your representative from Imagic or whatever distributor is handling that product, and I say to you, Ethan, retail buyer, what video games are you looking for this Christmas of 1983, sir? We're banned in America now.
Ethan has
or what they'll say is, and this is the problem I'm alluding to. Okay, that game that you have here, if you're an Activision or a Magic that has some good product, that game looks incredible. We do want to take that game from you. We think that game will sell. However, your last two games are not selling at all. So if you will take back these previous games, maybe we'll think of selling that. So even to get their new games out, they often have to eat their older games. That's kind of the give and take, because both sides want to sell the new games, but both sides have some bargaining power. And this is the time when retailers can really put pressure on manufacturers to be like, you're going to have to do some stock rebalancing. You're going to have to take some of this stuff back. And so even if they can get one or two of their new games on the shelf, they're not necessarily making the profit they're accustomed to on those games, even if they can still sell them at a decent price, as the manufacturer, because they're having to eat their old inventory in order to get it on shelves.
Alex, you just mentioned a key word here that's, I guess, a tangent, but an important one, manufacturing. So now we're talking about companies like Activision, Imagic, and so on and so forth. They're not manufacturing their cartridges. And we talked already about how in 79, 80, 81, there wasn't the manufacturing capability to keep up with demand. That all changes going into 82. So obviously there must have been a cottage industry of some kind, or some kind of additional capacity was built up by manufacturers. The question now is, who were those players? What did this look like? And how did this downturn affect them? Was there suddenly a bunch of bankruptcies of third-party manufacturers for cartridges that may have also played a role in how the industry went forward in the next couple of years? Or were they just general manufacturers who were able to switch to other product categories?
Well, some of these companies did do their own manufacturing. Atari did all of its own manufacturing. And in fact,
Apollo did its manufacturing.
The infamous,
really? Games by Apollo even?
Yep, there's footage of their factory.
Activision started out doing their own manufacturing, then managed to, I don't know all the details of it, but they basically managed to, let me see what this says here. Activision did do contract manufacturing with a company called Selectron. And I don't know what happened to Selectron. Activision itself was able to kind of navigate this. Their operations guy, Alan Epstein, did a good job of navigating this with them so they didn't get too burned. But I don't know about Selectron, how they did.
Yeah, I think most of these guys, they were just growing up in the electronics field in general. I don't think their only business was manufacturing cartridges. Of course, as we have to, as we're on the manufacturing thing, let's touch on Alamogordo for a second.
Yeah, because I was going to say, the famous burial in New Mexico of Atari product was happening because Atari was closing its factory in nearby El Paso, Texas. Because Atari was accelerating. They'd already started, but they were accelerating their move to overseas manufacturing as part of their response to this situation. And by overseas, we mean Taiwan and Hong Kong. I think they also had some stuff in Puerto Rico. But they were getting into offshore, which this is kind of when offshore was really, more broadly, only just starting to become a big deal anyway. The idea of going to Taiwan and Hong Kong. Atari was not at the front of the curve. There are other companies that already started doing it earlier, but they're in the middle of the curve somewhere.
So there's probably other stories like that are just less famous. And what they buried there was not returns.
No.
Just to be extremely clear, because why would a factory be taking returns? A factory doesn't handle returns. They were burying what half-manufactured stuff they had, and that's what's in that landfill that people spend a bunch of money digging up.
Right. And because again, these companies did not accept returns in the way that some of the older video game histories try to characterize that. Product was returned, but the vast majority of product that was returned, and I'm sure there were exceptions, was either stock balancing, where you did take it back, but they had to take something else. For instance, Atari's plan, which Billboard talked about, is they had a 2-for-1 stock balancing plan, where for each game you returned, you had to commit to 2 more games.
Which I'm sure helped.
There was stock rebalancing returns. There was the whole, in Atari's case, and we won't go into detail on it again, there was the whole reorganization of the distributor thing, where they took returns from distributors that they were dropping. And then they would sometimes take back, these companies would sometimes take back defective product. And so I think there was probably an uptick in this period of time of retailers passing off product that wasn't defective as defective to try to, recoup money,
So as Atari is landing these kind of, 2 big things, that they're distributor rebalancing and then they wind up flooding the market, and then the closing of the plan, which becomes the symbol for everything that's going on. People at the June 1983 CES realize video games are just not the future. The media companies that were planning stuff, a couple of them got out a few cartridges, and they were mostly out. Sega stays in, but they don't do the licensing. They don't do the media licensing stuff. They stay in until 85, but they start doing stuff with Bally because they have kind of like a coordinated relationship with Bally. It's complicated. Read my book. And basically it's seen that there's going to be a 15% drop in video game profits and revenue, and 150% growth for computers. So everybody turn their eyes to computers. Okay, let's do a little turn. Are we there? Okay, we're in the direction of computers. Of course, there is Coleco with their Atom computer set to change the world.
Yes.
And Mattel, I think they still have the Aquarius out there, kind of.
Yes. I like bringing this up every time the Aquarius comes up. The Aquarius, of course, is being, marketed in 1983, and the staff at Mattel like to say that the tagline for the Aquarius should be the Mattel Aquarius, the computer of the 1970s today.
And then, of course, you have the actual players.
Yeah. And, just kind of build off of this thing with the June CES, Activision, using Activision as a bellwether. Activision at the January CES said everything's great, everything's wonderful, it's amazing. In May, they go public in March, and they have a successful IPO. In May, they report that they had record sales and profits in fiscal 83, which again covers 82 and 83. They're not on a calendar year, fiscal year. And then in June, they report for the first time that they report signs of trouble. They say that their first half fiscal 84 sales, which again are in 83 because their year goes to, I think, March, April to March fiscal year, that their first half sales are going to be about even in terms of sales, but income will be, and the exact quote from the Activision people was, significantly lower. This is the first time Activision, who's been rah, 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 hooray, we're great all year long, is now like, oh.
You didn't quantify it, but that adverb worries us. Can you drill down a little harder on the significantly part?
And a quote from Jim Levy at this time: anybody who focuses on just video games will be in trouble going forward. Last CES, he was like, oh, we're just making a strategic move. This time he's like, get the hell out of video games right now.
Yeah. Now that we're gone from it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're not gone.
They're not gone from it. And they really finally see the end of the road in 84. 84 is when they go to the remainder people, the closeout people.
Right. No, I mean, there must have been. After the June CES, the June CES marks the time at which your buyers have now gotten the information that they need. We need to know your sales numbers for the fall because we're going to manufacture this stuff. We're going to have it in your grubby little hands by November to have on your shelves. Very different environment than 12 months hence.
And the channel is still flooded. I mean, there are some newer games that have come out that are going to do okay, like Ms. Pac-Man from Atari and Qbert from Gottlieb. Some of the newer
Parker
Activision stuff. Gottlieb is the coin-op company. Qbert from Parker Brothers. And some of the you read my train of thought there.
There was a Star Wars title, I think, that was in 83. That was a Parker Brothers.
And some of the Activision, that's what I was going to say. And some of the newer Activision stuff was going to do okay.
Hero.
Mm-hmm.
Is Hero 83 or 84?
83. It's 83.
83. Okay.
I think there's been a thing online where people say it's 84. But it's actually 83.
But basically, there's still so much product in the channel that the retail buyers become super selective. They're only going to take certain titles, and they're only going to take a certain amount of certain titles. A store that may have ordered 20 copies of a game in 1982 is going to order 3 or 4 copies of the next hit game in 1983. It becomes a more selective market, and that's where the third parties realize that they can't keep up. And again, it's just the channel has busted, and prices on new stuff actually don't soften too much. So, at the end of the year, the EIA estimates that the average cartridge price was $19 in 1983. So obviously
the median would have been really different
right.
or whatever.
So, so it's not so much that all of the prices on everything collapsed. The new stuff softened a little bit. The new stuff that maybe you could have gotten $30 to $35 for next Christmas, you're going to get, $20 to $25 this time. The successful stuff is still going to sell a little bit, but there's just so much glut in the market that these companies can't sell much of their new product in, not enough of it to sustain the whole operation, especially as they're continuing to eat the old product through price protection, stock balancing, returns, etc.
Let's do a bin check. What does a bin look like? What does our discount bin look like in November of '83?
So I actually have
I have some photos of those.
Yeah, I have an ad. I have a Toys R Us ad from Spokane, Washington, which used to be one of the favorite test markets
Yes.
of companies.
Can you do a screen share? Because that'll show up on the recording for the patrons. If you've got it on your screen.
Yes, probably. I mean, I know how
You
screen share
plebeians only listening
generally. I
at
just
home
haven't
are-
done it in Skype.
You have to pay to see our faces.
Here we go. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Cool. So this is a Toys R Us ad, and they have things in categories here.
Yes.
So at the very low end, they have their $5 discount. And what is it? It's really failed companies and really old stuff. So Data Age, which by this time has gone bankrupt and is liquidating and is dumping stock.
Well, here's an interesting thing about that. It's actually reported that some companies bought up the rights to the companies that had failed, and then they are dumping it on the market.
Exactly.
Too.
And that's, I think, what happened with Data Age.
Yeah, that's specifically, yeah.
And so we have Data Age, Bugs, Encountered L5, and then Dale's favorite from earlier.
Haunted
From
House,
the discount
baby. There
bins,
you are,
Haunted House.
baby.
You have the older and the oversaturated or just the less successful Atari stuff in this $4.97.
$4.97 for those titles, by the way.
Yes.
Now, is this just leftover inventory, or is this because we talked about this last time that Atari was thinking that they were going to market their way out of this? Is this still Atari pushing leftover product into the market?
I mean, the majority of this
is
stuff
on there?
is like 80 and 82. Like 80 to 82 is all of what's on here. This is stuff that was manufactured back then, and they had a good run of it, but then they made too much. And this is stuff that's still just sitting in the channel.
And then some of it's demons to diamonds. So then the next tier up, the $7.97 tier, we're seeing
Expensive.
the older Activision stuff and some, less successful Imagic stuff. Like these aren't the companies that have gone completely bankrupt, and it's not Atari's 5-year-old games that no longer sell. So they maintain a little more value, but not a lot more value.
Those are literally Activision's less loved titles, right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
the
then
Laser Blast is cool.
Then you have your $10, which is really, I think, where your more normal clearance items live, the stuff that isn't from your bankrupt companies and isn't 5 years old. Yeah, they have some Intellivision stuff there in this category. And then they have, like Demon Attack was hugely popular in 1982. I mean, it was a successful game in 1982. So this is, I think, an example in this $10 field and Atlantis was also popular. You're starting to see some of the stuff the newer stuff that just isn't moving in this glutted market, and kind of, they're trying to do that at the $10. And then you can see the stuff that's more successful in the last two categories here, the $25 and the $28
Like
fields.
Pac-Man's still not down.
Pac-Man is still big. It really is a myth that Pac-Man was any kind of trouble for Atari.
$24.97 to purchase Pac-Man.
Because that's an early 1982. Yeah. Over a year and a half.
Yeah, over a year.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Wow. And I mean,
Buck
when you
Rogers.
think about it, and as you've mentioned before, Alex, put an adult uneducated about the titles or the value of these in the store, and you can get one of each of those games from the previous three tiers coming home with 3 games for the equivalent of this Atari Pac-Man.
Exactly.
Or Buck Rogers.
And, they're real sports games, which were their upgraded sports games. They're doing okay. Buck Rogers, Sega's, one of Sega's latest releases. And then, the really top tier Activision, Activision's still holding its own. These are the big guys. These are games that, sold 1 million or more copies each, not crackpots so much, but it's new. So it's still in here with these guys. And then, Mega Mania was a 1 million plus seller. Pitfall, of course, a huge seller. River Raid, a huge seller. So, that's where that is. And then, look at our consoles up here.
Wow.
The Atari VCS, after the $30 rebate, which I mentioned earlier, Atari had dropped the price, the suggested price, to about $89, and then there was a $30 rebate. So now it's $60. So,
but wait, that's $60 with Pac-Man included.
No. Combat and Pac-Man cartridges included.
Oh my God.
That's huge.
Well, that seems almost like a disconnect. Why would one purchase you'd have to be desperate to purchase your Pac-Man cartridge.
So,
but if you didn't have it already,
So, if you have 27.97, the value, it just isn't there. Now you see Coleco is doing better. Now it's still down from where it was at its height.
They're still probably not making money on the
but
Coleco
it's still
system.
Maintaining a better price point. And it's still, Donkey Kong is the standard pack-in. They haven't had to throw in extra stuff to get people to buy it. And so this is kind of a good snapshot. And, Toys R Us was a major retailer of video games. So kind of a good bellwether to see what this was kind of looking like in late 1983. It's not that everything was going for $5. But it's that enough things were going for $5, and the price protection that was built into some of this meant that it was harder for companies like Atari and Activision to continue to make money even on the few games they were still selling at something approaching full price.
So as we enter, the last half of 1982, it's like there's nothing you can do at that point. There was no proper coordinated effort by the industry to try and hold this thing back. And basically, by the October season, when people are supposed to be stocking for Christmas, they are just like, we're not buying nothing. We exaggerate here. There were the new titles that came out, like Mario Brothers and stuff. They bought some units and they sold some units, but all these companies had to make more than they could sell into the channel.
It was a grind to get anything new out. You had just experienced 3 years of demand that couldn't be met. The growth was there, and this is the polar opposite. Now it's a nightmare. Now every new product you're coming out with, you'll have to negotiate its positioning, its sales, just to get it out, to get rid of the glut of your Demons and Diamonds and Video Olympicses, and they're still there. And worse, in 1983, you got some jerk like me who's gone back to his parents to be like, look, I'm sorry about the thing from remember the thing from 3 years ago? Well, it's done now. I need this new thing called a VIC-20. And they're like, can you play your games on it? And I'm like, no. So we're going to have to get new games too, but you need to purchase the VIC-20 for this Christmas. And they're like, oh, we give up. You're hopeless. Why can't you just enjoy the thing we purchased you the year before last? So, by the way, I'm still hitting on them on a monthly basis for the Pitfalls and the River Raids of the world. Those are,
see, Dale
your Christmas and your birthday.
He was a discerning consumer.
Adults today would understand, because they'd just be like, oh, it's like that one time I went from an iPhone 9 to an iPhone 11. But there wasn't that concept of an electronic.
No, my children don't have this problem. I'm damn well aware of the Switch. And how much is that game? Oh, it's only $89 before tax. Yeah, I get it.
Oh, being in Canada. Basically by October.
You mean this is what I have to look forward to?
Oh yeah.
October 83. Everyone's basically saying video games are no longer a growth market at all. And the regular toy industry, they're seeing a resurgence. And I know you're going to cover this on the show, Carl, but board games and toys like He-Man and whatnot are picking back up. And basically 40% of cartridges are in deep discount, not just regular discount. 40% of the stuff on the market is between $4 to $10. That is, and And the big games of the last year, they weren't selling very well. And there's an estimate that actually says that in 1982 there were 30 million cartridges that didn't sell. And that's what's being kicked in the channel at the moment. 30 million cartridges that need to go out, and Atari's not destroying them. The other companies have no way to get around this sort of thing. And yeah, then 1984 comes, and it's a bloodbath.
Yeah. In January 1984, James Morgan, the new CEO of Atari, who is actually trying to revive the video game industry. He thinks Atari went too far in the home computer direction and believes that there's still money to be made in video games. Just to give context, in January 1984, he says America is mazed out and shot out. Because that's what a lot of this was. Mazed out and shot out. Because all of these games that these lesser companies were doing, they were all Space Invaders clones. They were all Berserk clones. They were all Pac-Man clones. They were all Defender clones. It's like there were, with all of these different games on the market, there were really only like 5 archetypal games that all of these dozens of companies were releasing over and over. And some people
kind of recognize that, like, that bout in creativity, but ultimately that, the idea that just bad games killed the market. It's like most of these games are playable. And even if you compare them to the big shots of the time, there's not that much difference.
It's not that there's bad. It's just that you don't need 5 versions of Berserk on your VCS.
Yeah.
You just don't.
So what you're really saying is we needed more Custer's Revenge, because that was something.
Yeah, very unique.
There you go. So yeah, I mean, the bottom just completely falls out, because by that time nobody's making money anymore. The problem is that even the companies that have some okay new games like Activision can't make money anymore. And so those companies start going to the closeout companies themselves. Activision in 1984 takes that step because basically, because their CFO of all people, who was only their CFO for about a year, between 83 and 84, he randomly wrote an autobiography. I wish more random executives would do this. So, it's not about the video game industry, but he has a chapter on Activision. And so, they had the backup. They had all of the older games that they weren't able to sell. And so they're trying to figure it out. And as he put it, you have 3 options. I mean, you can keep trying to push them into the channel, which is just not working. You can destroy them. You can destroy them.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a cost involved in destroying them. Even if, as he put it, the way their value proposition was, if they could sell their games at just over $1, they would still make more money on them
than
destroying them and taking the write-off. So as long as they could get something, it was still better for them than destroying them, even if in some ways it was short-sightedly maybe not better for the channel. And so they were able to find a closeout company that was willing to take their stock for not very much, but was still able to, give them a little more than $1 a game.
Right.
And so, for these companies, they had to keep flooding the channel, because by destroying them, they would take a loss. And even though flooding the market was probably worse for the overall industry, you don't care what's going to happen to the overall industry if you're not going to be around to enjoy it. They had to recoup their costs.
And of course, that's something that, when Nintendo comes in, that's something that they become aware of. And a lot of people talk about that because they just see, that there's a devastating hole. But the idea that you need to be working together to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen, like that is a huge lesson that I think Nintendo took from this.
Absolutely. It absolutely is, because, all of these companies are basically in survival mode, and most of them don't survive. And the ones that survive are really badly burned. Activision loses money for 16 consecutive quarters. And, that ends with all the mediagenic shenanigans and all of that way down the line. They pay for it. Imagine away this huge toy giant whose traditional toy business, because as Ethan said, there's a resurgence in this time. Their traditional toy business is doing great right now. He-Man is doing great for them right now. But even with their traditional toy business, the albatross of their electronics business is so bad that Mattel nearly vanishes. Their banks won't talk to them. And they finally are able to get the famous junk bond king, Michael Milliken, to give them some money. And, as Milliken said, when Kalinsky approached him, he said Barbie cannot go bankrupt, by which he meant that he believed in the power of the Barbie brand.
No,
and
he was just being.
I do want to just mention, how does Mattel exit the market, because they show up at the 1984 Winter CES with a huge booth. They're like, we are still strong. We're still looking good. And then they immediately after the show, and everyone internal knew that this was going to happen, they destroy Mattel Electronics. They get rid of it and they sell it, to Terrence Kalinsky and all that stuff. But they needed to put on that face, which I think, illustrates the thing I was saying at the beginning, that just because they were saying what their plans were does not mean they didn't know there was a problem. In Mattel's case, they were extremely deceptive to make sure that people didn't cancel what little orders they had before they destroyed everything.
Well, when I interviewed Don Daglow, he actually had Don Daglow had an explanation for this, and he said that it was because it was traditional in the toy industry that if it looked like somebody was going to go out of business, you would just delay those payments from the Christmas business because, once the company's gone, then you get to keep the money. And that was the main reason to have the big stand, was to get those toy retailers to give them their money before they shut it all down.
And I think that's probably true. I think that's probably very true.
By January of 84, too, anyone savvy enough has watched several computer companies, including Behemoth TI, and what happens when you have to actually spring the notice on the public. We've had our internal discussions. We're out of market. And that's throwing a grenade in the room.
Yep. So basically, in 84, analysts lose interest. The media loses interest. All of the, the media conglomerates are out. They were, aside from Sega Enterprises Inc. continues on for a little bit in kind of the limited capacity. But some of the media people do go to edutainment and stuff on home computers. And then, of course, Atari cancel the 5200, and they're like, 7800 is going to bring us right back. And then Jack Tramiel and good old Zonix is still there.
And James Morgan was a real believer in the video game business and that it could be brought back. And the press was entirely against him. Everyone, press and analysts both said it is nuts that Atari is trying to revive the video game business with the 7800. But James Morgan was a true believer. I've interviewed him, and he really felt that Atari's problem was that they had tried too hard to push into the computer space and should have stuck with what they knew best. And I mean, I think the Nintendo experience kind of bears that out. Now, it was too late. It was too late for Atari to save the business. They had too many losses. There was too much of an albatross around their neck. But I mean, Morgan was probably right that a grassroots refocusing on video games and the value proposition of a higher quality video game console was the way to go. He just, contrast that with Coleco, who could have gone that route and instead decided to get on the home computer bandwagon with everything else and torpedoed themselves with the Atom. Morgan's instincts were correct, but there was just no way to execute that kind of plan in this time period.
So in 84, just as as the market looks, it's like everything goes down, but still the units being sold, there's 75 million in 83. It's still 54 million cartridges are still being sold in 1984, but the revenues are so low that you can immediately tell that there's a problem.
Whereas this is all backstock at this point because there are almost no new releases, virtually no new releases in 1984.
It would be really interesting to see an equivalent of an 84 version of that same Toys R Us ad that probably doesn't exist because it's so bad. That's in 84 November. This is where you're seeing cartridges for 99 cents. This is where you're getting. This is where the wall. This is where the greeter at the door is handing you the copy of Demons Diamonds. If you were just nice coming into there, you go.
And on your
or
exit,
sending their people
you
out
get
to
space
stick
shot.
it under your windshield wiper while you're in the store, and you're like, "Whoa, what's this?
I like that.
Is it a flyer? No, it's a VCS game."
Yeah.
A bunch of them rolled over by cars and lying in the parking lot as you're driving out. Yeah.
At least they didn't have to destroy it. So then, by 85, even the reporting is just basically non-existent. People just don't care about video games anymore.
And the EIA stops tracking it. The Electronics Industry Association, which
the
puts
grown-ups
on CES,
don't care about
they stop
video
tracking.
Games. The grown-ups stop caring about video games.
After Nintendo comes back in, there are some people who try to do some estimates. It's estimated that maybe 20 million games were sold in 1985, where we went from the peak 75 million to 20 million games that are all being sold at discount. And
Atari reported 1 million in sales of their consoles for 85, which is probably true. I don't think they were.
Yeah, they were still selling it. One of the other problems
is that come Christmas of 1984, the issue on the ground was that you had to go to your parents and explain to them that even though they purchased you the VIC-20 the previous year, see, this year you need to purchase something called a Commodore 64. And that's going to require even more explanation than trying to get last year. You've got to do way more dancing this year.
But at least it's about the same price by that time. That's the
only shot you got.
Yeah, that's
this thing keeps going down. Your parents, by the way, have noticed that VCS that they bought you 4 years ago is now practically being thrust in their faces for $30. And they're starting to notice it. It's like, doesn't this stuff go down in price dramatically over a short period of time? And you're like, yes, but Christmas occurs in December, and we need to get me the Commodore 64 now, you see.
And then in 85, of course, famously, Nintendo put out the thing that it was $100 million across consoles and game revenue. It may have been as high as 500 million, but if you compare that against 20 millions of software alone, you can see that they're selling for nothing. Yeah. They have completely and utterly just shed any sort of respectability. Nobody's looking at it as a growth market anymore, and home consoles and home computers are not making that up. Not even sans the price collapse. They're barely up on how many units they can do per year. They're not growing at nearly the rate that people were thinking they were going to.
The hardware, even with all the price cutting and everything, the hardware is too expensive and the software is too pirated. So,
software is very costly.
Well, and this does beg an interesting question, because we talked about how Coleco tries to shift over their hardware business into computers with the Atom. We've seen how Mattel tries to pull it off with the Aquarius, and so on and so forth. So what about the transition of software companies from console to computer?
Most of them just can't make up the volume that they were doing. Imagic tries to do it. They are on the home computers, and it just isn't. It doesn't give them nearly enough to sustain. They go out in 85.
You're coming from a business where $1 million is a hit into a business where 100,000 is a hit, and yes, your costs are lower because you're not doing cartridges. But even then, I mean, to pivot a company like that, you just can't do it because they have the overhead of a console company operation trying to make it in the computer game world. So the computer game companies, there's some shakeouts there too, but I mean, the computer game companies are continuing to just go along and do their thing. But even a company like Activision, which becomes the second largest computer game company by revenues to Electronic Arts in the United States, loses money for 16 consecutive quarters because they can't make that pivot. They're still paying for what happened to them in the cartridge market. Not only do they still have inventory that they're trying to get rid of, but they're still paying the price in other ways. I've talked to a lot of people that were at Mediagenic, at Activision in the late 80s. And some of the sales and marketing people there said they were still paying the price for all of that glut back in the day, because retailers, when they were dealing with them in computer software, retailers were still imposing terms on them that were not the best for Activision because they had the leverage because of all of that console inventory nonsense. We'll take your computer games, sure, but you still owe us for all of this cartridge junk you dumped on us a couple of years ago. They were still paying a price in their ability to sell in software in the late 80s from what happened during the console crash.
So basically, quote unquote, fresh companies like EA had a leg up because they weren't saddled with that stigma on the side of the retailers. Exactly. Even though they couldn't take advantage of maybe name recognition on the part of consumers who had moved from the VCS to a C64, let's say.
They also weren't selling into the same retailers. They were going through computer stores and the emerging software shops.
There was some overlap depending on the product and on the platforms you were targeting. There was some overlap.
As you say, the user base is an order of magnitude less than what it was at the peak of when the VCS was king.
Especially the paying user base, if you're in software. I don't just say that to joke either. I mean, piracy has always been a sales depressor.
Yeah. Well, you could imagine my delight when it turned out that the software for that Commodore 64 was more or less like $1.50 a disc, and that's what you needed. And if you got a little hole punch, you could get them down to 75 cents a disc, frankly. This stuff is amazing.
Yeah. And in Britain, there was kind of a mini software crash about 1983, and that's because that's about the time that the dual tape, the double tape decks got down to a price where ordinary families could have them in their homes. So, you could just start duping all of those specky tapes.
Pure audio, one end to the other. And not only that, you could buy like a 90-minute tape, and if you kept track of where your tracks were on the counter, you could fill the tape full of software, provided you were willing to fast forward or rewind to the point that you needed.
All right.
The tape.
Let's sum up on the crash. So there's definitely been a thing where some people have said that the crash didn't mean nearly as much as they thought it mean, especially the people who are in other parts of the world like Europe and Japan. But the North American home video game crash of 1983, and we probably shouldn't even put a year on it. I think there's only been one North American home video game crash, so I don't think we need to specify. It altered the state of the entire industry from top to bottom. It changed the way that companies dealt with retail. It changed what companies were prominent. It created rippling effects, and how consoles were made from then on.
And it remained it remained a specter for a long time. Even into the 90s, even into the late 90s, every time that there was maybe a slightly rocky transition or a slight down year, people in the business would start whispering, "Yep, there it is. It's happening again, like we always knew it was
going to happen again, and you didn't listen, and now it's happening again." And it kind of all. I mean, we hit that little slump in the 90s where that was truly indicative that it was coming again.
The almost crash, as Alex has dubbed it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So basically, what we have here is the growing pains, the lessons learned, and the killing, in many ways, of those initial companies that got it all started, which opened up. I mean, Nintendo may or may not have ever had a chance to slip into the market had this not happened. The other players would have been too established. Who knows if the NES would have technically been impressive enough to dethrone whatever the next generation Colecovision would have been, or next generation Intellivision, had this crash not happened. So what we have really is the formative event, that the cataclysm that allows for the rise of the mammals. Once the dinosaurs of that initial programmable revolution, and I avoid that whole generation nonsense. Sorry, anybody who wants to stick to that, no. So the first programmables have to die for the lockout chip enabled hardware producer gets a cut of the software action model that is the foundation of consoles today had to happen.
Yeah. I mean, the through line of the modern industry really starts in 1983 with companies like Nintendo and Sega releasing their first consoles in Japan. Like, obviously there are connections going back further than that. You know, all history is connected, but like the true industry through line is post-crash. The business models, the companies, the expectations, everything that you had kind of in that late 70s and late 80s market, there's like a solid cutoff. And the industry that we think of today, it evolved out of that new industry that started in 1983 rather than out of that old industry.
Yeah. So the takeaway from our episode today is the
Coleco walked so Nintendo could run? I don't know.
Yeah, there we go.
We owe the NES to the color purple.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Now, I will say that at
and
some
Bob
point
Dylan.
we should not in the imminent future, but come back and look at the arcade crash that was going on concurrently with this as well, because I think that will also help color the lack of product that they were able to work with in that time period, and how the other players that were not primarily home players like Sega, what happened to them in that interim, and how that set up a whole new era in the post arcade crash period that had, you know, the slight connections to the home crash.
We call that episode, gee, why is the arcade not crowded anymore?
Wait, there used to be a Pac-Man machine in my supermarket. Why is it now a gumball machine again? What happened? Well, I think, Ethan, the one quote that you had earlier from the Atari exec talking about how we needed more unique product for consoles is probably the best. And really, when you think about it, we've joked a lot about E.T. here, and we joked about Raiders of the Lost Ark, but those were attempts to get away from the high score chasing, get you to die quick, so you have to throw in another quarter game design of the arcade to something that would actually function at home. Now, those are horribly flawed designs, but it's an attempt.
83 and 84, the lingering console games that remain, you start seeing the change in this idea. And then on home computers, it becomes a bit more developed. So if the American market did not crash, they may have still been the predominant force in that thing. You know, that thing needed to change. It could not remain the same as the arcade and, you know, have that same appeal. And people over here are recognizing it, but it's the style in Japan that won out. And they may not have done it if there was compelling product that went in that direction that was not interrupted by the crash.
Yeah, very true. And so maybe we need to not only do an episode about the arcade crash, which maybe Alex can find us a good, date that we can sort of peg to that to use as a...
There's a funny date, but I'll tell you later.
And maybe we can do one whole episode, our musings on an alternate history, where E.T. did not suck and actually does.
E.T.'s just a Pac-Man clone. The Atom doesn't exist. The ColecoVision goes on to the ColecoVision 2 picks up the mantle in 1985, and this Johnny-come-lately Nintendo company doesn't get its
Atari concludes its deal with Nintendo for the Famicom, and then just sits on it to push its own systems.
Really...
Oh yes, that one. Good call. That is
an excellent one. Or Jack Tramiel stays at Commodore and they turn the Atari, what will become the Atari ST, into a game console. Or even better, Amiga actually releases their chipset as a console using floppy disks in 1985.
We're off the rails, folks.
Has disrupted the space-time continuum. Carl, I think this is against protocol.
Your kids, Carl. We've got to do something about your kids.
Back to the future.
This is why it's dangerous to time travel, Carl. You know this.
All I have to say is I thought I was going to get by just handing my kid a controller and a Raspberry Pi and say, there's enough games here to keep you busy until you can earn your own money.
All right.
Oh, well. Okay, everybody. So from all of us here, hope everybody enjoyed this. This was our 2-part look at the crash. We will definitely come together again in this constellation for whatever other big major events deserve this treatment, because I think we all had a good time doing this, at least us here. I don't know about people at home who have to listen through this.
God, if you're still with us, God bless
I'd like to thank all of our panel members once again. Remember, if you guys want to actually see us talk about this, join the Patreon. It's $1 a month. You get early access to the interviews, too. Got some good stuff coming up there. And beyond that, links to all the wonderful things these fine folks produce are in the show notes. And from all of us, have fun.
Bye.
I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.